Chapter 1. Introduction. Why the War of 1870-71 was decisive for Europe. Imagine a time when the map of Europe looked very different. Germany did not exist as a unified nation-state, but as a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and principalities. France, on the other hand, was a great power with a glorious past, ruled by Emperor Napoleon III, the nephew of the famous Napoleon Bonaparte. In this world of monarchies, alliances, and rivalries, a war broke out in 1870 that was to change the order of the continent for decades, the Franco-German War. At first glance, one might think that it is just another war between neighboring states, triggered by diplomatic intrigue and national rivalry. But if you take a closer look, you can see that this war was a turning point. He decided on the founding of the German Empire, on Prussia's rise to European hegemony, on the overthrow of the French Empire, and the birth of the Third Republic. And he sowed a conflict between Germany and France that was to have an effect for a long time to come, until the world wars of the 20th century. Why the history of the War of 1870 at all? The question arises, why should we still deal with this war more than 150 years later? The answer is clear. If you want to understand why Europe was shaken by wars in the 20th century, you have to go back to the roots, and these lie in the conflict of 1870-71. Nationalism. The war marked the triumph of German nationalism. An alliance of princes and kingdoms gave rise to the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. This made a decades-long dream of many Germans come true, but also a nightmare for France. Power shift. Until then, France had been the dominant power on the continent. After 1871, Germany took over this role. This shift in the balance has had immense consequences for European diplomacy. Thoughts of revenge. France had to cede Alsace-Lorraine to Germany after its defeat. This disgrace of 1871 became a central motif of French politics and one of the causes of the First World War. Modern warfare. The war was one of the first modern wars. Railways transported troops at an unprecedented pace. Telegraphs transmitted messages. Modern artillery and rifles dominated the battlefields. In other words, the Franco-German War was not an isolated event, but a catalyst for developments that have shaped Europe to this day. The fascination of the topic. The War of 1870-71 is more than a sequence of battles and treaties. It is a magnifying glass through which we can see the ideas and tensions of the 19th century. The age of nationalism. In Germany, students, workers, and citizens rejoiced together when the longed-for unity was finally achieved. In France, on the other hand, the pride of the empire was shattered. The end of an era. The fall of Napoleon III marked the end of the Second Empire. In Paris, citizens rose up and proclaimed the Third Republic, and a little later even the revolutionary Paris Commune. The birth of a new power. Germany, previously a fragmented country, now stood united, militarily strong, economically aspiring, politically ambitious. And yet the war is not only a success story of German unity. It is also a story full of suffering. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians died, cities were besieged, hunger and disease spread. Paris was bombarded by Prussian shells, while the population was desperately looking for food. This mixture, national triumph on the one hand, human tragedy on the other, makes the War of 1870 a fascinating but also ambivalent chapter in European history. The common thread of our journey. So that we don't get lost in the abundance of events and names, we divide our narrative into individual chapters, similar to a journey through the past. We start with the prehistory, the political tensions between France and Prussia, the rivalry between Napoleon III and Bismarck, and the famous Ems Dispatch. Then we turn to the battles and campaigns, from the first battles in Alsace to the decisive defeat at Sedan. An important part will be the Siege of Paris, which shaped the war like hardly any other event. But we also look at the social consequences. How did people in Germany and France react? What political upheavals did the war bring? At the end, we take a long history of its impact. The French idea of revenge, the German self-perception as the war of the founding of the Reich, and the shadow that the conflict cast on the 20th century. What to expect? This script is not a dry string of years. It is a tale of emperors and chancellors, of soldiers and civilians, of triumphs and tragedies. We will ask ourselves, why did Napoleon III risk a war he could not win? How did Bismarck manage to unite the German princes behind him? What did the capture of an emperor mean for Europe? And how could hunger, cold, and political despair drive an entire capital into revolt? There will be moments when we will be amazed, for example, at the efficiency with which Prussia mobilized its army. And there will be moments when we are shocked, for example, when we look at the number of victims or the cruelty of the siege of Paris. It is precisely this tension between splendor and misery, between national triumph and human catastrophe, that makes the War of 1870-71 a topic that still captivates us today. In the next chapter, we will devote ourselves to the prehistory. How did the war come about in the first place? What role did German nationalism, Napoleon's political ambitions, and the famous Hohenzollern candidacy play? Because one thing is certain, this war did not just break out of the blue. It was the result of years of tension, rivalry, and diplomatic intrigue. Chapter 2: Prehistory, France, Prussia, and the rivalry for supremacy. To understand the Franco-German War, we have to take a step back to the decades before 1870. Because this war did not fall from the sky, it was the result of a long development. Political rivalry, national ambitions, and diplomatic maneuvers laid the ground for a conflict that seemed almost inevitable. At the center are two figures who could hardly be more different: Napoleon III, the Emperor of the French, and Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian Prime Minister. One was a monarch who tried to build on the glorious past of his famous uncle. The other was a sober strategist who wanted to advance German unity with cold calculation and an unwavering will. A power struggle unfolded between them that put France and Germany on a confrontation course and led Europe into a war that changed the continent. France's situation under Napoleon III. When Napoleon III was proclaimed emperor in 1852, France was marked by new beginnings and splendor. Paris underwent its major transformation under Baron Haussmann. Boulevards and magnificent buildings were built, and the economy flourished. In foreign policy, Napoleon III was looking for ways to lead France back to the top of the European powers, a place that his uncle Napoleon I had once occupied so spectacularly. But the reality was more complicated. France had prestige, but militarily and politically, the situation was no longer as dominant as it used to be. One new rival in particular grew up: Prussia. Napoleon III knew that France had to defend its supremacy, otherwise it would soon be marginalized. That is why he kept looking for glorious wars that would strengthen national self-confidence and legitimize his rule. But these wars, for example in Mexico or against Austria and Italy, often ended indecisively or even in fiascos. France increasingly looked like a power that failed because of its own ambition. Prussia's rise under Bismarck. While France tried to preserve past greatness, Prussia experienced a meteoric rise. The man behind it was Otto von Bismarck. In 1862, he became Prime Minister of Berlin, and soon he did everything he could to solve the German question in the interests of Prussia. Bismarck had a clear goal: the unification of the German states under Prussian leadership. But he also knew that this goal could only be achieved through wars. Not through speeches and majority decisions, as he famously said, but through iron and blood. He skillfully led Prussia through 3 conflicts. In 1864, the German-Danish War, in which Prussia conquered Schleswig and Holstein together with Austria. In 1866, Prussia defeated Austria, and thus gained supremacy in Germany. And finally, the war against France, which he was to conjure up in order to bind the southern German states to Prussia. After the victory of 1866, it was clear that Austria had been ousted from Germany, and the North German Confederation was created, a forerunner of the later German Empire. For Bismarck, unification was almost complete. All that was missing was a common enemy that would also drive the southern German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden,
into an alliance with Prussia. And that enemy was easy to find: France. The contrast between Paris and Berlin. The rivalry between France and Prussia had many facets. Political, France wanted to maintain its role as the leading power in Europe, while Prussia expanded its position as the new hegemon in Germany. Geopolitical, France feared being encircled by a united Germany. Prussia's victories over Austria had already raised the alarm in Paris. Psychologically, Napoleon III was looking for a gain in prestige in order to stabilize his empire domestically. Bismarck, on the other hand, was specifically looking for a way to drive France into war in order to complete German unity. One could say that while France tried to preserve past greatness, Prussia was working on a future that was inevitably linked to France's weakening. The role of the southern German states. A decisive factor were the states south of the Main. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt did not belong to the North German Confederation. They were suspicious of Prussia's dominance, and France hoped to be able to draw these states into an alliance against Prussia. But the national mood among the people was different. Many people in southern Germany had long felt themselves to be Germans and longed for unity. Bismarck knew that if France were to attack, the southern German states would hardly fight on Napoleon's side. Instead, they would join Prussia. This is exactly the scenario he wanted to bring about. France's demands and Bismarck's calculations. In the years after 1866, Napoleon III tried to curb Prussia's growth in power through diplomatic demands. He demanded compensation, such as areas on the Rhine or Luxembourg. But Bismarck cleverly rejected these claims, or even put France on the defensive. One example is the so-called Luxembourg crisis of 1867, when France wanted to acquire Luxembourg, but Prussia vetoed it. In the end, Napoleon III had to take a back seat and lost prestige. It became increasingly clear that France was isolated, while Prussia gained influence. The tension grew, and both sides knew that an armed conflict was only a matter of time. The spark, the Hohenzollern candidacy. The immediate trigger of the war was ultimately a question of the succession to the Spanish throne. In 1868, the Spanish Queen Isabella II had been deposed, and Spain was looking for a new king. Leopold von Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, a distant relative of the Prussian king Wilhelm I, was under discussion. For France, this prospect was a nightmare. A Hohenzollern on the Spanish throne would have meant Prussia in the east and an allied Spain in the west. France felt encircled. Napoleon III and his diplomats reacted sharply. They demanded from Prussia not only Leopold's renunciation, but a permanent guarantee that no Hohenzollern would ever ascend the Spanish throne. This is where Bismarck intervened. He knew that the situation was ideal for luring France into a trap. King Wilhelm I was quite willing to let the issue rest, but the French exaggerations offered Bismarck the opportunity to make France appear as the aggressor. The Ems Dispatch, the road to war. In July 1870, the famous scene occurred in the spa town of Ems. The French ambassador Benedetti called on King Wilhelm I to give the required guarantee. Wilhelm politely but firmly declined. He then sent a report to Berlin, the so-called Ems Dispatch. Bismarck edited the text in such a way that it appeared brusque and insulting. Then he had it published. The effect was devastating. In France, people felt humiliated, while in Germany they felt nationally united. Napoleon III was under enormous pressure. The press, parliament, and the public demanded war. On July 19, 1870, France officially declared war on Prussia, exactly what Bismarck wanted. With that, the stage was set. A diplomatic dispute over the Spanish throne succession had turned into a European war. France appeared as the aggressor, Prussia as the defender. And behind Prussia, not only the North German Confederation, but also the southern German states rallied together. In the next chapter, we turn to the beginning of the war. How did both sides mobilize their armies? What was the mood in Paris and Berlin? And why did France so fatally underestimate Prussia's clout?
Chapter 3. The Hohenzollern Candidacy and the Ems Dispatch. Sometimes it is small diplomatic gestures that shake the world. A candidacy for a distant throne, a polite conversation in a spa town, a dispatch with a few sharply worded sentences, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers are already marching into war. This is exactly what happened in 1870, when the so-called Hohenzollern candidacy and the Ems Dispatch provided the last spark that exploded the powder keg between France and Prussia. This chapter takes us right into the diplomatic drama that shook Europe and finally opened the way to war. Spain without a king. The starting point was not in France or Germany, but on the Iberian Peninsula. In 1868, the Spanish Queen Isabella II was overthrown after a revolution. Spain was left without a monarch, a dangerous state of affairs in a country marked by political crises and internal divisions. The Spanish government was feverishly looking for a new king who would bring stability. But who should take over this office? A candidate had to be acceptable in terms of foreign policy, viable domestically, and at the same time willing to take on such a delicate task. Soon, the focus fell on Germany, more precisely on Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen. He came from a Catholic sideline of the Prussian royal family. He was attractive to the Spaniards. As a German, he was considered independent of Spain's domestic political factions, and his kinship with the Hohenzollerns promised prestige. France's nightmare, encircled by Hohenzollerns. For France, the prospect of a Hohenzollern on the Spanish throne was a shock. Prussia's rise in the east had already worried Paris. But if there was now also an ally of Prussia in the west, France felt downright encircled. The French press sounded the alarm. A Prussian prince in Madrid would destroy the balance of power. Napoleon III was under pressure to react decisively. His opponents in Parliament and the public demanded that he get the Prussian king to give in. But one thing was overlooked in Paris. Leopold himself was not particularly keen on the Spanish crown. He had already hesitated before when he was offered the throne. But France's fear turned a vague idea into an international flashpoint. Bismarck's calculation. For Otto von Bismarck, the matter was a perfect opportunity. Although he had not initiated the Hohenzollern candidacy himself, he immediately recognized the benefits. If France reacts harshly, Bismarck could portray it as the aggressor. If France were to give in, its prestige would be damaged. In both cases, Prussia would benefit, whether through strengthened national unity or through a weakened French government. Bismarck himself later wrote that he had hoped to lure France into the trap. For him, the candidacy was a lever to exacerbate tension and make war more likely. French pressure on King William. In the summer of 1870, the situation came to a head. Under pressure from French diplomacy, Leopold declared his renunciation of the Spanish throne on 12 July. This could have been the end of the crisis. But Paris wanted more. Foreign Minister Gramont demanded a permanent guarantee from King Wilhelm I that no Hohenzollern would ever accept the Spanish crown in the future. That was an affront. Wilhelm I was prepared to let the matter rest, but such a guarantee would have violated his dignity and humiliated Prussia. He declined, politely but firmly. The meeting in Ems. On July 13th, the decisive moment came in the spa town of Ems. King Wilhelm was staying there to relax when the French ambassador Count Benedetti visited him. Benedetti repeated the demand, a binding promise that no Hohenzollern would ever accept the Spanish crown. Wilhelm remained calm but rejected the request. He declared that the matter was settled, nothing more. The meeting was outwardly correct. It was not a scandal, not a public scene. But Benedetti felt that his mission had failed, and Wilhelm I was annoyed by the pressure. After the conversation, he reported to his Prime Minister Bismarck on the course of events. The Ems Dispatch. Wilhelm's report was factual and sober, but in Bismarck's hands, it became a sharp sword. The text was shortened and tightened so that it sounded as if Wilhelm had brusquely rejected the French ambassador and refused any further discussion. Bismarck had the revised version, the famous Ems Dispatch, published. The effect was dramatic. In France, the text was read as an insult to national honor. The press raged, the population demanded retribution. In Germany, on the other hand, pride was felt. The king had not allowed himself to be humiliated by France. Bismarck had achieved exactly what he wanted. The mood boiled over on both sides. The war was now almost unavoidable. France declares war. Napoleon III was caught in a trap. Domestically, he was weakened. His opponents were only waiting for a sign of weakness.
The nationalistic mood in the country left him no room for maneuver. On July 19, 1870, France declared war on Prussia. But the Kaiser had no idea that he was doing Bismarck the greatest favor. Now the Germans appeared as defenders against a French attack. The southern German states joined Prussia, exactly what Bismarck needed to complete German unity. Why the Ems Dispatch was so decisive? The Ems Dispatch is a lesson in the power of words. Not a shot had been fired, no line had been crossed, and yet a few lines in the newspaper led directly to war. It shows how skillfully Bismarck played with public opinion. He knew that in a time of nationalism, hurt feelings and wounded honor were enough to drive an entire people into war. For France, the dispatch became a symbol of humiliation. For Germany, it is a beacon of national self-assertion. And for Europe, it was a signal that a major war was inevitable. France's declaration of war began a conflict that was to change the map of Europe. In the next chapter, we turn to the beginning of the war. How did both countries mobilize their armies? Why was Prussia so organizationally superior? And how did the people in Paris and Berlin experience the first days of the war?
Chapter 4. The Beginning of the War. Mobilization and Enthusiasm for War. On July 19, 1870, France officially declared war on Prussia, a message that went through Europe like a thunderclap. Newspapers published special editions, people poured into the streets, politicians gave feverish speeches. Finally, what had been in the making for years had happened. The power struggle between France and Prussia was to be decided on the battlefields. But as so often in history, the expectations were very different from reality. While there was initially jubilation and enthusiasm in both countries, it soon became clear that organization, strategy, and technology were to decide far more about victory and defeat than patriotic speeches. France goes to war. In Paris, in the days after the declaration of war, there was an atmosphere like in a play that is finally reaching its climax. Newspapers outdid each other with patriotic headlines, and crowds celebrated the emperor and his generals. Many French people remembered the glorious times of Napoleon I, when France had dominated all of Europe. Now, many believed the opportunity had come to build on this tradition. "To Berlin," shouted the masses, convinced that the French army would quickly defeat the Prussian enemy. But this euphoria concealed deep problems. The French army had not been modernized for years. There were new rifles and artillery, but the structures were outdated. The generals were divided. Many commanders were old or undecided. The mobilization was chaotic. Trains did not run on time. Soldiers had to wait days for marching orders, and equipment was missing. France wanted a quick war, but it became clear in the first few days that it was not prepared for it. Prussia reacts with iron discipline. The situation was completely different on the German side. In the North German Confederation, mobilization had been planned in detail for years. Responsible for this was above all Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke, a man who embodied modern warfare like no other. Prussia's army benefited from three decisive advantages. Railway network. While France was still improvising, the Germans transported their soldiers to the border with meticulously prepared timetables. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers reached their places of deployment within a few days. General Staff System. Moltke had developed a system in which all commanders acted according to clear plans. Decisions could be implemented quickly and consistently. Alliance with southern Germany. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt joined Prussia after the French declaration of war. This meant that almost 1 million soldiers were under German command. Thus, the outbreak of war in Germany seemed like a huge engine that suddenly started up, smoothly, precisely, unstoppably. National enthusiasm in Germany. In Germany, too, the mood was characterized by enthusiasm. Newspapers called for the defense of the fatherland, students volunteered, patriotic songs were sung in towns and villages. For many Germans, it was more than just a war against France. It was a war for unity. Finally, many thought, North and South Germans would fight side by side and prove that they were a common people. It was particularly remarkable how quickly the population of the southern German states sided with Prussia.
Just a few years earlier, many Bavarians and Württembergers had looked suspiciously at Prussian dominance. But now they perceived France's declaration of war as a threat and moved to Berlin's side. Cheers and doubts. But in addition to the enthusiasm, there was also skepticism. In France, some politicians sensed that the war was risky. Napoleon III's opponents warned that the army was unprepared and that Bismarck had deliberately brought about the situation. In Germany, too, there were voices that saw the war not as a defensive war, but as a calculated provocation. But these voices were lost in the jubilation. Most people felt only one thing. Finally, they were no longer fighting against each other, but together. Europe is looking to the West with excitement. The declaration of war did not remain without echo in the rest of Europe. Britain remained neutral, but observed with concern that the European balance could be shaken. Russia was friendly with Prussia and used the situation to seek its own advantages in the East. Austria-Hungary hesitated. It would have liked to take revenge for the defeat of 1866, but the domestic political situation did not allow for war. Thus, France stood practically alone, while Prussia and its allies acted as one. The train to the border. While the diplomats were still calculating and the press was printing headlines, the soldiers started moving. In France, poorly organized units marched north and east, many without clear orders or adequate supplies. In Germany, trains ran according to plan. Soldiers sang patriotic songs and hoisted flags on the wagons. The border between Alsace and Lorraine and the Rhine became a parade area for hundreds of thousands of men. Soon, it was to become the front line. War expectations. Expectations were high, perhaps too high. In France, people believed in a rapid, triumphal march to Berlin. In Germany, they hoped for a defensive war that would crown unity. Both ideas were illusions. The war would be longer, bloodier, and more destructive than many thought. But as late as July and August 1870, the conviction prevailed everywhere. Everything would be decided in a few weeks.
Chapter 5. The First Battles. Wissembourg, Wörth, Spicheren. No sooner had war been declared than the armies marched towards each other on the border between France and Germany. Both sides were convinced that a quick victory would soon be achieved. But as so often in history, expectations and reality were two different things. The first battles, at Wissembourg, Wörth, and Spicheren, showed with brutal clarity that France was at an organizational and strategic disadvantage. For Germany, on the other hand, these battles were a prelude that set the direction for the entire war. France's plan, a rapid advance. Napoleon III and his generals had hoped to take the initiative with a rapid attack on German territory. A quick victory was supposed to consolidate the mood in their own country and separate the southern German states from Prussia. But even during the mobilization, it became clear that France was not in a position to do so. The French army was concentrated in Alsace and Lorraine without a clear strategic line. The commanders, among them Marshal Macmahon and Marshal Bazaine, were at odds. Orders were given contradictory, troops were moved without a uniform operational plan. So it happened that the French did not end up on the offensive, but on the defensive, and that's exactly what the German side took advantage of. The Battle of Wissembourg, 4 August 1870. The first clash took place in the small border town of Wissembourg in Alsace. There was a French division under General Abel Douai, around 8,000 men. It was actually only intended as an outpost, but the location became its undoing. On the morning of August 4, Prussian and Bavarian troops attacked with more than 30,000 soldiers. The French fought bravely, but they were far outnumbered. Douai himself fell early on by an artillery shell, a serious blow to the morale of his men. The French defended Wissembourg street by street, but in the afternoon they had to retreat. The city fell, hundreds of prisoners were taken, the losses were high. For the German side, it was a first victory that had not only a military but also a symbolic effect. Bavaria and Prussia had fought side by side, and the unity of the German troops proved its worth. The Battle of Wörth, 6 August 1870. Only 2 days later, the next major confrontation broke out, this time in Wörth, French Froschwiller. Marshal Macmahon stood here with around 45,000 Frenchmen.
Opposite them, about 90,000 German soldiers from Prussian, Bavarian, and Württemberg units. The battle began in the morning with artillery fire that shook the French positions. MacMahon's men defended themselves fiercely. The French cavalry in particular showed spectacular but desperate attacks. Hussars and cuirassiers stormed against German lines, but were mowed down by rifle and cannon fire. Despite brave resistance, the French could not withstand the superior force. In the afternoon, their front collapsed. MacMahon had to retreat. His troops fled in disarray. The losses were devastating. Over 10,000 French soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. On the German side, the number of victims was also high, but the victory was clear. The Battle of Spicheren, 6 August 1870. On the same day, a major battle took place further west, near Spicheren, near Saarbrücken. Here, about 30,000 French under General Frossard met around 40,000 German soldiers. The French had entrenched themselves on the heights of Spicheren, a strong position overlooking the valley. When the Germans attacked, they were initially repulsed by heavy fire. Prussian regiments stormed the heights several times, but were thrown back with heavy losses. It was not until late afternoon, after hours of fighting, that the Germans managed to conquer the heights. French counterattacks failed, the troops withdrew. The battle cost both sides enormous casualties, but strategically, it meant another German victory. The French had to move further west, their defensive line was broken. The consequences of the first battles. The 3 battles within a few days had far-reaching consequences. For France, the dream of a quick advance into Germany was over. The army suffered heavy losses, morale sank, confidence in the leadership was shaken. Unrest spread in Paris. A quick victory had been expected, but already in the first week, the French were on a losing cause. For Germany, the victories strengthened the self-confidence of the troops. Prussia and the southern German contingents had shown that they were powerful together. The unity on the battlefield was palpable. In addition, the way deeper into France now opened. For Europe, the news of the battles spread quickly. Diplomats in Vienna, London, and St. Petersburg registered that France was falling behind. The isolation of Napoleon III became increasingly clear. The myth of the French cavalry. Especially in Wörth, the dramatic images of the French cavalry attacks were imprinted in the collective memory. Elegantly dressed cuirassiers with shiny helmets rode against German infantry, a picture from times gone by. But modern rifles and artillery turned these heroic attacks into massacres. Many observers realized that the time of the cavalry as a decisive weapon was over. The War of 1870 showed that modern technology, rifles with a fast rate of fire, precise artillery, coordinated infantry, decided the battle. After the defeats of Wissembourg, Wörth, and Spicheren, the French had their backs to the wall. Napoleon III and his generals had to reorganize their troops and withdraw to the north. The decisive battle was soon to follow there, at Sedan. In the next chapter, we turn to this dramatic turn, the Great Battle of Sedan and the capture of Napoleon III. Chapter 6. The Great Turning Point, Battle of Sedan and the Capture of Napoleon III. The defeats in Wissembourg, Wörth, and Spicheren had hit France hard. But nothing had been decided yet. Napoleon III hoped to stop the German troops with a new army and turn the tide of the war after all. To this end, he raised a large force at Sedan, a small fortified town in the Ardennes. It was an attempt to stop the advance of the Germans and protect Paris. But this attempt ended in a catastrophe that shook Europe. The Battle of Sedan on September 1st, 1870. The situation before the battle. After the first defeats, Napoleon III gathered a new army under the command of Marshal MacMahon. About 120,000 men were to regroup in the Ardennes and stop the German advance. The Kaiser himself was there, sick, exhausted, but determined not to end the war as a loser. On the German side, Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke led the operations. With almost 200,000 soldiers, the Germans marched north. His goal was clear, to encircle the French army and force it to surrender. Sedan, near the Belgian border, seemed to be a safe location for the French. The fortress was strong, the surroundings hilly, the rivers offered natural lines of defense. But Moltke recognized the weakness. Sedan lay as if in a trap, surrounded by heights that were ideal for artillery. The morning of September 1st. The battle began early in the morning. German troops from Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, and Württemberg attacked. They took the surrounding heights and began to bombard the French positions with massed artillery fire. The French army was practically surrounded. Every attempt to break out was met with superior German forces. The battle was particularly dramatic near Basels, a small suburb of Sedan, where Bavarian and French troops fought house-to-house battles. Entire streets burned, civilians fled, and the village became a symbol of the bloody war. The French cavalry last desperate attack. When the situation became hopeless, the French cavalry tried to turn the tide. Under General Marguerite, thousands of cuirassiers rode against the German lines, a desperate attempt to break the siege. It was a picture of heroic despair: shiny helmets, waving flags, thundering hooves. But the reality was cruel. German rifles and cannons mowed down the attackers. Marguerite himself was seriously wounded. His riders died en masse. The attacks were spectacular, but senseless. This also meant that the last hope of the French was gone. The capture of Napoleon III. In the course of the day, Napoleon III realized that the battle was lost. He was ill, suffered from pain, and could hardly intervene actively. When he saw the countless corpses in the fields, he decided to prevent further bloodshed. In the evening, he had a white flag hoisted and capitulation negotiations began. On 2nd September, the entire French army surrendered to Sedan, around 120,000 soldiers, including the emperor himself. The news spread like wildfire. An emperor in captivity. Europe was shocked. For France, it was an unparalleled humiliation. For Germany, a triumph. The consequences for France. The defeat of Sedan was more than a military defeat. It was a political earthquake. In Paris, the news hit like a bombshell. Trust in Napoleon III was finally destroyed. On September 4th, crowds stormed the Paris City Hall, proclaimed the Third Republic, and deposed the emperor. Napoleon III himself was brought to Germany, sent into exile, and was never to exercise power again. With Sedan, the Second Empire had collapsed. The consequences for Germany. For Germany, Sedan was the decisive victory. The largest French army was destroyed, the emperor was captured, the way to Paris was clear. The German princes and soldiers rejoiced. Newspapers spoke of the victory of the nation. Sedan became a symbol of unity. Prussia, Bavaria, Württemberg, and Saxony had fought and won together. For the first time, many Germans really felt part of a common nation. Europe after Sedan. The battle was also closely followed abroad. Great Britain and Russia recognized that Germany had risen to be the new great power. France, on the other hand, was politically isolated and weakened. Sedan marked a turning point. A limited war had become a key European event. Memory of Sedan. Decades later, Sedan was still remembered in Germany. September 2nd was celebrated as Sedan Day. Schools held commemorations, monuments were erected. For France, on the other hand, Sedan remained an open wound, a symbol of defeat and humiliation that fueled the desire for revenge. After Sedan, the war seemed to have been decided. But France continued to fight. Paris did not want to accept defeat. A new government mobilized troops, and the capital prepared for a siege. In the next chapter, we look at this dramatic chapter: the Siege of Paris, Hunger, Balloons, and Resistance.
Chapter 7. The Siege of Paris, Hunger, Balloons, and Resistance. After the Sedan disaster, France was on the ground, at least militarily. The emperor was in captivity, the Second Empire collapsed, but France did not surrender. In Paris, the Third Republic was proclaimed, and with it began a desperate struggle for survival. While Prussia's army marched victoriously westward, the new French government decided to continue the war. Paris, the heart of France, was not to fall. But in September 1870, the Germans surrounded the city and began a siege that is one of the most dramatic episodes of the 19th century. Paris in a state of emergency. At the time, Paris was the largest city in Europe after London, with over 2 million inhabitants. It was the political, cultural, and economic center of France. When the news of Sedan arrived, the population reacted first with indignation, then with uproar.
On September 4, people stormed the Hôtel de Ville, proclaimed the Republic, and vowed to resist to the last. The mood was combative, but also characterized by panic. Food became scarce, rumors circulated, people feared German troops at the gates of the city. But at the same time, a wave of patriotic enthusiasm arose. Citizens armed themselves, volunteer associations were founded, women sewed flags and associations. The German siege ring. Moltke and the German generals did not hesitate. After Sedan, around 200,000 soldiers advanced westwards and completely surrounded Paris. Soon, the city was cut off. No train, no ship, no road led out. The siege ring was a masterpiece of Prussian organization. Positions were erected on the heights around the city, artillery was brought into position. The goal was not an assault, but a systematic starvation of the metropolis. Hunger and despair. After just a few weeks, the blockade had an effect. Supplies ran out, bread became scarce, meat prices exploded. Wealthy Parisians could still afford delicacies, but for the mass of the population, a struggle for survival began. Soon, unusual animals ended up on the plates. Dogs, cats, rats, and finally, even animals from the zoo. The fate of 2 elephants from the Jardin des Plantes, which were slaughtered and sold, became famous. The images of people waiting in long queues for a piece of bread went around the world. Paris, otherwise a city of luxury, had become a symbol of hunger and deprivation. Balloons as a lifeline. But Paris did not give up. To overcome the blockade, the French relied on inventiveness. Since no messages could leave the city, an unusual means of communication was developed: tethered balloons. Over 60 balloons rose from Paris during the siege. They carried letters, newspapers, and sometimes politicians or couriers across the German lines. This kept the city connected to the outside world, at least for a while. Carrier pigeons were also used to bring back tiny messages. This improvised airmail was a small technical miracle and morally maintained the resistance. Life in besieged Paris. Daily life in the besieged city was marked by hardship. Schools closed, theaters became military hospitals. Women organized soup kitchens, children collected wood for fires. Soldiers and civilians froze in the cold of the winter of 1870-71. Nevertheless, an astonishing will to persevere. Many Parisians saw the resistance not only as a military necessity, but also as a question of honor. Deutsche Artillerie. The German troops around Paris were faced with a dilemma. On the one hand, they wanted to force the city to capitulate, but on the other hand, they shied away from the massive use of artillery against the civilian population. It was not until January 1870 that more intense shelling began. Grenades fell on residential areas, people died in their homes. But even that could not break the resistance immediately. The winter of 1870-71. Winter became the greatest enemy of the Parisians. Cold, hunger, and disease killed thousands. Horsemeat became the main food, bread stretched with sawdust. Contemporaries described scenes of misery that were almost unbearable. At the same time, political tension grew. Radical Republicans demanded a continuation of the war at all costs. Others wanted to make peace to prevent further suffering. The unity of the city threatened to break apart. The capitulation. Eventually, the resistance was no longer tenable. On January 28, 1871, the French government signed an armistice. Paris opened its gates, German troops marched solemnly through the city, but only symbolically so as not to provoke the population even more. It was a bitter defeat for France, a triumph for Germany. But the siege had left its mark: a traumatized population, a destroyed economy, and a deep enmity that was to last for a long time. Symbolism and memory. The siege of Paris became a symbol of French steadfastness as well as of German efficiency. Balloons, hunger, and the images of winter misery shaped the memory of entire generations. In Germany, Paris was seen as the place where victory was finally sealed. In France, on the other hand, memory was equally marked by shame and pride. Shame about defeat, pride about resistance. After the capitulation of Paris, the war was decided militarily. But in other parts of France, armies continued to fight. on the Loire, in the Jura, in Belfort. And in the meantime, a completely different spectacle was being prepared in Versailles, the founding of the German Empire. In the next chapter, we look at the war in the West and South, the Army of the Loire, Belfort, and Dijon.
Chapter 8. The War in the West and South. Army of the Loire, Belfort, Dijon. While Paris was besieged by the German armies in the icy winter of 1870-71, the war in France was far from over. Although the main army had been defeated at Sedan and the capital itself was surrounded, resistance was regrouping in the provinces. The newly founded Third Republic did everything in its power not to accept defeat. It called for a people's war, raised new armies, and tried to stand up to the Germans on several fronts. These efforts unfolded especially in the west and south of France, along the Loire, in the Jura, in Burgundy. There was fierce fighting, which could not change the outcome of the war, but showed the energy with which the French fought even after Sedan. Gambetta's call for resistance. A central figure in this phase was Leon Gambetta, a young Republican politician. After Sedan, he fled Paris, spectacularly, in a tethered balloon over the German lines. In Tours and later in Bordeaux, he organized the resistance of the provinces. Gambetta was full of energy and optimism. He called on the people to rise up and directed the formation of new armies. Within a few weeks, hundreds of thousands of men were drafted, farmers, workers, students. Often poorly armed and barely trained, but with strong Republican zeal. These armies of the Republic were intended to show that France was not defeated, even after Sedan. The Army of the Loire. The most important of these new forces was the Army of the Loire. It was built in the autumn of 1870 south of Paris, between Orléans and Tours. Their goal was to break through the siege ring around the capital and rush to the aid of the trapped people. At first, the Army of the Loire actually achieved successes. In November, it managed to recapture Orléans from the Germans. In Paris, this news triggered jubilation. Finally, relief seemed possible. But the German generals reacted quickly. Reinforcements were brought in, and on 4 December, the decisive battle took place near Orléans. The Army of the Loire, inexperienced and poorly coordinated, could not withstand the German attacks. It broke apart, retreated to the south, and Orléans fell back into German hands. Thus, the hope of horrifying Paris had finally failed. The War in Burgundy, battles for Dijon. Further south, in Burgundy, the French government tried to establish another focal point of resistance. Near Dijon and the surrounding area, there were several battles between French troops and German units, including Bavarian and Prussian contingents. It was particularly noteworthy that French volunteer associations were also formed in this region, led by well-known personalities such as Giuseppe Garibaldi's son Riccio. The Italian freedom fighter Garibaldi himself offered his services and led a corps of volunteers. But here too, the French were poorly equipped and poorly coordinated. Although they managed to push back German troops temporarily, Dijon finally fell to the Germans in January 1871. The Siege of Belfort. Another center of resistance was the fortress of Belfort in eastern France, near the Swiss border. Belfort was heavily fortified and defended by a dedicated garrison under Colonel Denfert Rochereau. From November 1870 to February 1871, the French held out there, despite heavy German shelling. The defenders put up fierce resistance and refused to give up the fortress. It was only after the armistice of January 28 that the defenders surrendered, and then only because the French government ordered it. Denfert Rochereau was celebrated as a hero in France, Belfort a symbol of Republican resistance. Guerrilla war and popular resistance. In addition to the regular battles on the Loire, Burgundy, and Jura, there was irregular resistance in many regions. Peasants attacked German patrols, guerrillas carried out raids. The German army often responded with harsh reprisals, which only increased the hostility. This popular resistance showed that France was not prepared to surrender without resistance, but militarily it could no longer turn the war around. Why the fights were still important.
Militarily, the operations of the Army of the Loire at Dijon and Belfort were not an existential problem for Germany. The war was essentially decided with Sedan and the Siege of Paris. But these struggles had great political significance. They strengthened the Republican myth that France never stopped fighting even after the defeat. They prevented Germany from portraying the war as a completely smooth triumphal procession. They provided material for legends and national memory. Belfort, in particular, became a symbol of the unbroken French soul. While fighting continued in the provinces, the Germans prepared an event in Versailles that was to shape the entire 19th century, the proclamation of the German Empire. The next chapter deals with this historic moment, the founding of the German Empire in Versailles, the coronation of the German Empire.
Chapter 9. The War in Alsace-Lorraine, Civilian Population Between the Fronts. While the great battles in Sedan, near the Loire and around Paris attracted the attention of Europe, another, lesser-known but no less important chapter of the war was taking place in Alsace-Lorraine. This region, a bone of contention between Germany and France for centuries, became the immediate scene of the conflict. For the civilian population, the war meant more than headlines and reports of victory. It literally came to the front door. Villages were occupied, cities bombed, fields devastated. And after the war, Alsace-Lorraine became a symbol of a bitter rivalry between two nations. A border region with a double identity. Even before 1870, Alsace-Lorraine was a region of special importance. Geographically, it was at the intersection of Germany and France. Culturally and linguistically, it was mixed. German was spoken in many places, French in others, often a dialect between the two. For France, Alsace has been an integral part of the national territory since the treaties of the 17th century. For many Germans, on the other hand, it was a lost country that actually belonged to the German nation. When war broke out in 1870, Alsace-Lorraine became the first battlefield, and the civilian population became the plaything of events. The first fights, Wissembourg and Wörth. The very first battles of the war took place here, in Wissembourg and near Wörth. Entire villages were destroyed by artillery fire. Peasants fled from advancing troops. For many Alsatians, this was the beginning of a bitter experience. They were not spectators, but directly affected. After the defeats of the French, their troops retreated to the west, and soon almost all of Alsace was under German control. Occupation and everyday life. The German army established a strict administration in the occupied territories. Villages had to pay taxes, farmers had to hand over their supplies, cities were subject to contributions. For the civilian population, this meant requisitioning of grain, cattle, and wine, quartering of soldiers in private houses, controls and restrictions on freedom of movement. Some Alsatians greeted the German troops, either out of actual sympathy or to avoid conflicts. Others offered passive resistance, refused to pay taxes, or helped fleeing French soldiers. Destruction and suffering. The situation was particularly bad in Lorraine, where heavy fighting raged in August and September 1870. Cities like Metz experienced sieges that lasted for weeks, while villages burned down in the countryside. Civilians were often pushed between the fronts. Those who supported the French risked reprisals by the Germans. Anyone who cooperated with the Germans was later insulted by the French as traitors. This inner conflict shaped the region beyond the war. Metz, a city under siege. A special drama took place in Metz, one of the most important fortresses in France. Marshal Bazaine was trapped there with over 150,000 soldiers. The siege lasted from August to October 1870 and affected not only the army but also the civilian population. Food became scarce, diseases spread, people suffered from hunger. When Bazaine surrendered on October 27th, not only his soldiers, but also many citizens were taken prisoner by the Germans. This was a shock for France, and a trauma for the people of Metz that shaped the city for a long time to come. Identity conflicts after the war. With the Treaty of Frankfurt in 1871, Alsace-Lorraine was officially ceded to the new German Empire.
For many residents, this was a deep cut. Around 100,000 people decided to remain loyal to France and emigrated. Others stayed, but had to take German citizenship. Schools, administration, and the judiciary were Germanized, and French receded. Many residents felt uprooted, neither quite German nor completely French. This identity crisis accompanied the region for decades and became a source of resentment that went far beyond the war. A focal point of the revenge. In France, the cession of Alsace-Lorraine became a national wound. Newspapers, speakers, and politicians invoked the lost provinces as a symbol of the disgrace of 1871. Children learned at school that one day Alsace-Lorraine would have to be brought back. Poets and painters created works full of melancholy and patriotism. The motto was, "Think of Alsace-Lorraine," a constant call for revenge. For Germany, on the other hand, the region was a prestige gain, but also a burden. The new border had to be secured militarily, and the mistrust of the population remained a constant challenge. The war in Alsace-Lorraine was more than a sideshow. It showed how much a conflict can change the lives of civilians and how deeply such experiences are burned into the memory of nations. In the next chapter, we will devote ourselves to the international dimension. How did Austria, Russia, Great Britain, and the USA react to this war? And why no one intervened decisively?
Chapter 10. The International Dimension. Austria, Russia, Great Britain, and the Attitude of the USA. The Franco-German War of 1870–71 was primarily a conflict between two neighboring states, but it took place at a time when the European balance was determined by questions of power. Any war could tip the scales, and the great powers of Europe watched events with a keen eye. France hoped to find allies to put Prussia in its place. Bismarck, on the other hand, did everything in his power to isolate France diplomatically. In the end, he succeeded in keeping the great powers largely neutral. This was a decisive prerequisite for the German victory, and one of the reasons why the war made the founding of the empire possible so quickly. Austria-Hungary, too weakened for revenge. For France, it was obvious to win Austria as a possible ally. Hadn't Vienna itself suffered a heavy defeat against Prussia only 4 years earlier? Didn't Emperor Franz Joseph have every reason to take revenge? In fact, there were voices in Austria that advocated entering the war. Many officers wanted to erase the disgrace of 1866, Battle of Königgrätz, but reality spoke against it. The Habsburg Empire was internally torn. The compromise with Hungary in 1867 had created the dual monarchy, but national tensions were great. Militarily, they had not yet been restored. The army had to be reorganized and equipped. A war against Prussia would have meant the risk of provoking Russia as well, and they wanted to avoid that. Thus, Austria-Hungary remained neutral. The events were observed with growing suspicion, but they were not prepared to make more than diplomatic gestures. Italy, torn between sympathy and realpolitik. Another actor was the young Kingdom of Italy. At first glance, one might have expected French support. After all, France had promoted Italian unification in the war against Austria in 1859. But the situation had changed. French troops were still standing in Rome and protecting the Pope. For many Italians, this was a nuisance. They wanted Rome as the capital of the United Kingdom. When the war against Prussia began, France withdrew its garrison to bring more soldiers to the front. With this, Italy was finally able to occupy Rome. On September 20th, 1870, Italian troops marched in, the Papal States ended, Rome became the capital. For Italy, this was more important than any partisanship in the war. It remained neutral, but indirectly benefited enormously. The USA, distanced observers. On the other side of the Atlantic, the United States also followed the war with interest. The American public was more pro-German. Many immigrants from Germany lived in the USA, and the sympathies were often directed at the emerging Germany. But officially, the US held back. After the Civil War, people were still busy with internal reconstruction, and Europe was far away. The war was registered, but not actively influenced. France's isolation. In the end, France remained completely isolated. No great power intervened, no army came to the rescue. Napoleon III had hoped to win Austria or Italy, but he had miscalculated. Bismarck, on the other hand, had used his diplomacy perfectly. Russia was bound by concessions. Austria was too weak and too cautious. Great Britain did not want to intervene. Italy had its own goals. So France stood alone, a decisive factor in its downfall. The European balance is shifting. The War of 1870–71 profoundly changed the balance of power in Europe. France plunged from the position of a leading great power into a phase of weakness. Germany entered the continent as a united nation-state and new hegemony. Russia gained room for maneuver in the east. Great Britain kept its distance. This laid the foundation for a new concert of powers that was to last until the First World War, with Germany as a new, ambitious player. Externally, France was isolated, but internally it was seething. Paris had fallen, but the war had sparked a whole new dynamic: the founding of the empire in Versailles. In the next chapter, we will dedicate ourselves to this historic moment: the founding of the German Empire in Versailles, the coronation of the German Empire. Chapter 11: The Founding of the German Empire in Versailles, the Coronation of the German Empire. The War of 1870–71 had hit France hard. Paris was besieged, the armies defeated, the emperor in captivity. For Germany, on the other hand, the moment now seemed to have come to realize a centuries-old dream: the unity of all German states. What had been a picture of longing for centuries became reality in the weeks of the siege of Paris. And the place where this dream took shape was not Berlin, Frankfurt, or Munich, but the Palace of Versailles, once a symbol of French greatness. On January 18, 1871, the German Empire was proclaimed there. The path to unity. German unity had not fallen from the sky. For decades, it had moved people, inspired poets and students, and driven revolutionaries of 1848. But the small state mentality seemed insurmountable. Too many princes, too many particular interests. It was only Bismarck's policy of iron and blood that accelerated the development. The victories of 1866 over Austria and 1870 over France created a new situation. The German princes were faced with the choice of joining Prussia or remaining isolated. The war against France acted as a catalyst. North and South Germans fought side by side. A common national feeling emerged. Now the moment had come to cast this feeling in the form of a state. Negotiations in Versailles. While the cannons thundered in front of Paris, the German princes negotiated in Versailles about the future shape of the empire. Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden hesitated. They did not want to give up their independence completely. Bismarck, however, knew how to win their approval through clever concessions. Bavaria, for example, retained a certain independence in the military and postal system, while Württemberg retained special rights. But the big picture was clear. A joint German empire was to emerge, under the leadership of the Prussian king. January 18, 1871. The date was chosen carefully. January 18th was the anniversary of the coronation of Frederick I as King of Prussia in 1701. Now, his descendant, Wilhelm I, was to be proclaimed German Emperor in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. The scene was filled with symbolism. In the magnificent Hall of Mirrors, which had once served as a demonstration of power by Louis XIV, the Sun King, German princes and generals now stood. Bismarck in white uniform, Moltke grave and silent, the princes with their ribbons. Prince Frederick William of Prussia stepped forward and proclaimed the proclamation. King Wilhelm I was now German Emperor. Cheers broke out, shouts of hurrah echoed through the hall, flags were waved. William himself accepted the homage rather reluctantly. He was not a man of grand gestures, and the crown was more of a burden than a pleasure to him. But the symbolic power of the moment was unmistakable. The small German states had become an empire. Symbolism and humiliation. It was a moment of triumph for Germany. For France, on the other hand, it was a humiliation. In Versailles, of all places, the heart of French royal power, the Germans proclaimed their empire, while French troops were defeated outside and Paris was starving. Many French people perceived this scene as a deliberate provocation. Later, it became a symbol of the humiliation of 1871, which remained deeply etched in France's collective memory.
Bismarck's masterpiece. Politically, the founding of the Reich was Bismarck's greatest masterpiece. He had understood how to bring the princes into line, to isolate France, and to present unity as a defensive success. The new Reich was by no means a modern nation-state in today's sense. It was an empire in which the princes retained considerable rights and in which Prussia had outstanding influence. But for the people at that time, it was the fulfillment of a dream. Reactions in Germany. The news of the founding of the Reich triggered enthusiasm in German cities. Bells rang, cannons thundered, newspapers printed special editions. Students sang patriotic songs, workers organized torchlight processions, citizens celebrated in the streets. Some were surprised at how quickly the unity had come. Just a few years earlier, it had not been believed that it could be achieved in such a short time. Now she was there, born during the war, crowned in Versailles. Consequences for Europe. With the founding of the German Empire, the power structure in Europe changed abruptly. Germany was no longer a patchwork of states, but one of the strongest powers on the continent, economically, militarily, and politically. France was defeated, Austria was pushed to the margins, Great Britain cautiously distanced. The other powers registered with growing concern. A new, ambitious empire was born, and it would have a decisive influence on Europe in the coming decades. With the founding of the empire in Versailles, the war was decided in its symbolism, but formally it still had to be completed. The next chapter is therefore about the peace negotiations and the Peace of Frankfurt, and about the consequences that these agreements had for both countries.
Chapter 12. The Peace of Frankfurt and its Consequences. After months of fighting, hunger, and political upheaval, the Franco-German War was decided militarily. Paris had capitulated, the French armies had been defeated, and the German Empire had been proclaimed at Versailles. But a war does not end with the thunder of cannons, but with treaties. The Treaty of Frankfurt, signed on 10 May 1871, officially sealed the end of the war and laid the foundation for an enmity that was to shape Europe for decades to come. The path to negotiations. After the capitulation of Paris in January 1871, an armistice had been concluded, but the conditions for the final peace still had to be negotiated. The German side came up with clear goals. France was to be permanently weakened. Germany wanted territorial gains. A high war reparation was to hit France economically. The French government, now Republican, was under duress. On the one hand, the country was tired of war. On the other hand, the mood among the population was characterized by indignation. No one wanted to see large territories, but peace was impossible without concessions. The venues, Versailles and Frankfurt. Initially, the talks took place in Versailles, where Bismarck resided at the headquarters. Later, they were moved to Frankfurt on Main, which appeared to be more neutral and better suited to sign the final contracts. On the German side, Bismarck conducted the negotiations with iron severity, but also with tactical skill. He knew now was the moment to reap the fruits of victory. The most important provisions. The Peace of Frankfurt contained 3 central points. Territorial cessions. France had to cede Alsace and a large part of Lorraine to the German Reich. Only Belfort remained with France because of his heroic resistance. This cession was a deep wound. The lost provinces became a symbol of French disgrace. War reparations. France had to pay a gigantic sum, 5 billion gold francs. For the time, this was an unimaginable burden. Germany wanted to weaken France economically and at the same time fill its own treasury. Military occupation. Until the compensation was paid in full, part of France remained occupied by German troops. It was not until 1873, after the sum was quickly repaid, that the occupiers withdrew. French reactions. In France, the treaty caused deep shock. Even those politicians who wanted peace spoke of a bloody disgrace. The population perceived the loss of Alsace-Lorraine as a national catastrophe. In schools, newspapers, and literature, the call for revenge arose. Children learned, "Think of Alsace-Lorraine." Painters and poets invoked the lost provinces. The idea of one day fighting back became an integral part of French identity. At the same time, however, France achieved a remarkable feat of strength. The 5 billion gold francs were paid faster than expected, a sign of economic strength and national pride.
German reactions. In Germany, the treaty was celebrated as a triumph. The return of Alsace-Lorraine was considered historical justice, a regained country that had supposedly always been German. The war reparations flushed enormous sums into the coffers. With it, the new empire was able to put its finances in order, build railways, and promote industry. The economic boom of the 1870s was closely linked to these payments. But not all Germans were satisfied. Some, like Bismarck himself, saw the danger. The annexation of Alsace-Lorraine had given France a permanent reason for enmity. What was a victory in the short term could become a problem in the long term. Europe and peace. The other great powers reacted differently. Britain remained distant, but took note of the fact that Germany was now the strongest land power in Europe. Russia used the opportunity to assert its interests in the East. Austria-Hungary had to accept that it was finally excluded from the leadership in Germany. With the Treaty of Frankfurt, the European order was redrawn. The German Reich was now at the center of the continent, powerful, united, ambitious. Long-term consequences. The Peace of Frankfurt was not just a treaty, but a beacon for the coming decades. In France, the emergence of the idea of revenge, which shaped foreign policy and led to an alliance with Russia and later with Great Britain. In Germany, self-confidence and national pride, but also a growing militarism. Alsace-Lorraine had to be militarily secured, and the border became a bulwark. In Europe, a new tension that upset the balance and ultimately helped pave the way for the First World War. With the Peace of Frankfurt, the war was officially ended, but for France, another dramatic episode began immediately afterwards, the Paris Commune, a revolutionary uprising that shook the country. In the next chapter, we look at this short but intense phase, the Paris Commune, Revolution after the defeat.
Chapter 13. The Paris Commune, Revolution after the defeat. The war was officially over, but peace did not immediately bring peace to France. On the contrary, the military defeat was followed by one of the most dramatic internal convulsions in French history. In the spring of 1871, the people of Paris rose up against their own government and established a revolutionary self-government, the Paris Commune. This uprising lasted only a few weeks, but it became a myth that had an impact far beyond France. For some, the Commune was a heroic attempt to create a fairer society. For others, it was an anarchic chaos that had to be crushed with all its might. The breeding ground: hunger, defeat, anger. The months of siege had exhausted Paris. Hunger, cold, and disease had left deep marks. In addition, there was the humiliation of the capitulation and the harsh Peace of Frankfurt. Many Parisians felt betrayed by the government in Versailles, the government that had proclaimed the Republic after Sedan and the deposition of Napoleon III. The simple workers and craftsmen in particular suffered. Unemployment, inflation, and housing shortages shaped everyday life. At the same time, they experienced how rich citizens had made their way better during the siege. The feeling of social injustice intensified the anger. Spark of revolution. The immediate trigger was the government's attempt to disarm the National Guard of Paris. This militia had been formed during the siege and consisted mainly of workers and small employees. Many saw it as a symbol of Republican freedom. When government troops tried to confiscate the cannons of the National Guard on March 18, 1871, the citizens opposed it. Soldiers refused to shoot at the crowd and fraternized with the insurgents. 2 generals were lynched. So the uprising was there. The government fled to Versailles. Paris remained in the hands of the revolutionaries. The Commune is born. The insurgents organized elections and proclaimed a commune, a form of self-government inspired by the ideas of the French Revolution. The municipality introduced a number of measures. Rent debts were waived. Factories that had been abandoned by their owners were to be taken over by workers. Separation of church and state was decided. Schools were reformed. Women were given more rights in public life. The Commune was an experiment that vacillated between socialist, anarchist, and republican ideas. There was only one point in agreement: resistance to Versailles and the treacherous government. Everyday life in revolutionary Paris. Life in the Commune was contradictory. On the one hand, there was enthusiasm. People took part in political meetings, discussed a new society.
Women played an active role, founded associations, and fought on the barricades. On the other hand, the city continued to suffer from hunger and insecurity. Many measures remained piecemeal because there was no time, but the symbolic power was enormous. For the first time in history, workers and citizens took power in a European capital for a short time. Versailles strikes back. The government in Versailles, under Adolphe Thiers, saw the Commune as a threat to the stability of France. With the support of the prisoners of war released after the armistice, it built up a powerful army. In April, the offensive against Paris began. German troops who were still in France held back. They did not want to intervene, but only to watch as France fought its own internal battles. On May 21, 1871, government troops entered the city. This was followed by the notorious Blood Week. Street fights, barricades, house-to-house fighting. The Commune put up desperate resistance, but the superiority was overwhelming. Blood Week. The last days of the Commune were marked by extreme violence. Government troops fought their way through the streets, while insurgents erected barricades. Entire districts were destroyed, including the Tuileries Palace and the Hôtel de Ville. In the end, Paris lay in ruins. Between 20,000 and 30,000 people were killed, tens of thousands arrested, many deported to New Caledonia. The Commune was wiped out, brutally and definitively. Myth and impact. Despite its short duration, the Paris Commune became one of the most important events of the European workers' movement. Socialists and communists all over the world saw it as a model. Karl Marx called it the finally discovered form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It remained a trauma for the French Republic. The split between conservative and left-wing forces deepened, and mistrust between the government and the population grew. And for Europe, the Commune became a portent. It showed that social issues could not be ignored, and that in times of crisis, entire societies could be thrown into turmoil. With the suppression of the Commune, a phase of chaos ended. But the social consequences of the war continued to have an impact in both countries, in Germany as well as in France. In the next chapter, we turn to the social consequences in Germany: militarism, national pride, and trauma.
Chapter 14. Social Consequences in Germany: Militarism, National Pride, and Trauma. The victory in the Franco-German War was more than a military success for Germany. It was a social earthquake. The founding of the German Empire, the return of tens of thousands of soldiers, and the euphoria over the triumph shaped the consciousness of an entire generation. But in addition to pride and self-confidence, the war also left traces of suffering, loss, and militarization that were to accompany the new Reich for a long time. Jubilation over the unity. In German cities and villages, a veritable ecstasy of joy broke out after 1871. Bells rang, streets were festively decorated, newspapers reported on the victories in special publications. The war was not only won, it had also brought the longed-for unity. For many Germans, this was the fulfillment of a decades-long dream. Students and workers, peasants and citizens had fought side by side, and the founding of the Reich appeared to be the crowning glory of this sacrifice. National pride became a unifying force, a pride that was soon reflected in monuments, festivals, and rituals. The Sedan Day. Hardly any event symbolized this pride more than the Battle of Sedan. September 2nd, the day of Napoleon III's capture, became an unofficial holiday throughout the empire, the Sedan Day. Schools held celebrations, children sang patriotic songs, veterans marched in parades. Monuments were erected in many cities commemorating the victory. Sedan became a myth, a symbol of German strength and French weakness. But this memory also had a dark side. It reinforced militarism, the idea that wars bring national greatness and conflicts are decided by weapons. Militarism as a social guideline. For many Germans, the War of 1870-71 confirmed the superiority of the Prussian military system. Discipline, organization, and technique had won. That was the common interpretation. This view had a lasting impact on society. The military received an enormously high reputation in the empire. Officers were regarded as role models, uniforms as a sign of prestige.
Military values such as obedience, a sense of duty, and a willingness to sacrifice were also emphasized in schools and in public life. Politically, the military became a pillar of the new Reich. Bismarck himself knew that the army had more legitimacy than parliaments or parties. This created a society in which military structures and ways of thinking had a deep impact on everyday life. The heroes and the victims. But in addition to the pride, there was also suffering. Around 45,000 German soldiers had lost their lives, and tens of thousands returned wounded. Families mourned the loss of sons, fathers, and brothers. Memorials were erected for the bereaved, widows' pensions were paid, but the personal suffering remained. In many communities, rows of graves and monuments stood as a constant reminder of the victims. Society learned to interpret death for the fatherland as honorable, a narrative that was reinforced in the decades to come. Economic upswing. At the same time, the war also brought tangible advantages. The huge French war compensation of 5 billion gold francs triggered an economic boom. Railways were built, industrial plants modernized, cities expanded. Many Germans therefore saw the war not only as a victim, but also as a source of prosperity. The upswing of the 1870s seemed to confirm the military success. National pride and demarcation. With unity and victory, self-confidence grew, and at the same time, the need to distinguish oneself from other nations. France became the hereditary enemy, Alsace-Lorraine a symbol of national strength. At the same time, the feeling of playing a special role in Europe increased. Germany was no longer a patchwork quilt, but a great power. This self-image nourished ambition and not frequently arrogance. First, traumas. But there were also traumas. Many veterans suffered from what today would be called war neuroses, insomnia, nightmares, anxiety. At that time, however, there was no understanding of these sufferings. They were considered weakness, concealed or suppressed. The civilian population also had scars. Families who had lost sons, cities that had to take in the wounded, regions devastated by the war. These wounds were less visible than the victories, but they accompanied the empire in secret. Culture of remembrance. Soon after 1871, a veritable culture of remembrance emerged. Warriors' associations organized meetings, collections, and monuments. Schools taught patriotic images of history that portrayed the war as a glorious victory. Literature and painting glorified the battles and their heroes. This memory was selective. It emphasized pride and suppressed suffering. But it was precisely in this way that she laid the foundation for a society that not only accepted wars, but even saw them as necessary. For Germany, the war was a triumph. For France, a trauma. But the social consequences were profound on both sides. While militarism and national pride were growing in Germany, the idea of revenge was germinating in France. In the next chapter, we will therefore turn to the social consequences in France, the idea of revenge, and the development of the Republic.
Chapter 15. Social Consequences in France, the Idea of Revenge and the Republic. While Germany reveled in the splendor of victory and the founding of the German Empire after 1871, France was marked by a deep wound. Defeat, loss of territory, and internal unrest had shaken the country. But out of this crisis arose a new political order, the Third Republic. And at the same time, a powerful feeling shaped society, the idea of revenge, the desire to erase the disgrace of 1871. National humiliation. The defeat in the war had hit France hard. For the first time in centuries, the country was no longer the dominant power in Europe. Even more serious was the symbolic humiliation, the founding of the Reich in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. In addition, there was the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. Millions of French people felt this was an unlawful removal. Newspapers, poets, and politicians incessantly conjured up the image of the lost provinces. On maps, the borders were marked with dotted lines to remind people that these areas were actually French. Children learned at school, never forget, always bring back. And so the idea of revenge became part of national identity. The idea of revenge. The call for revenge permeated politics, culture, and society. He showed himself in
textbooks that highlighted the disgrace of 1871, monuments that commemorated the fallen and at the same time called for the recovery of the provinces, political speeches in which the reconquest of Alsace-Lorraine was described as a national duty. This idea of revenge was not a short-term emotion, but a permanent attitude. He shaped French foreign policy until the First World War. Birth of the Third Republic. Politically, the defeat led to the end of the Second Empire. Napoleon III was in German captivity. His regime collapsed. It was replaced in 1870 by the Third Republic, initially as an emergency solution, but soon as a permanent form of government. The new republic had a hard time. It had to cope with the consequences of the war and the Peace of Frankfurt. It had to assert itself against monarchist forces that wanted the king to return. It had to overcome the division which had been exacerbated by the Paris Commune. Despite these difficulties, the Republic managed to consolidate itself. Step by step, it built up institutions that would last until 1940. Domestic political tensions. However, society was deeply divided. Republicans saw the defeat as an opportunity to build a modern democratic France. Monarchists hoped for a return to the monarchy and blamed the Republic for the disgrace. Socialists referred to the Commune and demanded far-reaching social reforms. These tensions turned France into a political powder keg. But at the same time, the French learned to live with the Republic, also because it was understood as a symbol of resistance against Germany. Militarization of society. The idea of revenge also led to strong militarization in France. The army was reorganized and modernized. Conscription was consistently implemented in order to always have a large reserve ready. Military parades, veterans associations, and patriotic celebrations shaped public life. The message was clear: one must be prepared to fight against Germany one day, whatever the cost. Culture and memory. The defeat of 1871 was also expressed in art and culture. Painters depicted scenes of bravery and suffering. Writers invoked patriotism and sacrifice. Especially in the schools, the memory of 1871 was kept alive. Generations of children grew up thinking that one day they would have to take back Alsace-Lorraine. So revenge became not only a political goal, but a cultural heritage. France on the move. At the same time, France was not only marked by grief and anger. The Third Republic relied on reforms: expansion of the education system, promotion of science and technology, economic modernization. Paris once again became a center of art and culture. This created a contradictory picture: a country that was obsessed with its defeat on the one hand, but also developed new forces on the other hand. While France lived with the idea of revenge after 1871, the whole of Europe changed. Germany had risen to become the new great power, and the balance shifted. In the next chapter, we will therefore look at the larger stage: Europe after 1871, power shifts and the path to the First World War.
Chapter 16. Europe after 1871, power shifts and the road to the First World War. With the Peace of Frankfurt and the founding of the Reich in Versailles, not only was a war over, but the European order was profoundly changed. A new player had entered the scene: the German Empire, united, powerful, and ambitious. France, on the other hand, was weakened. Austria was ousted from Germany, and Great Britain and Russia reacted with vigilant interest. The consequences of this shift were enormous. The War of 1870-71 was not only an endpoint, but also a starting point for developments that were ultimately to lead to the First World War. Germany as a new great power. Before 1871, Germany was considered a patchwork of principalities and kingdoms, politically weak and fragmented. Now it stood as a united nation-state with over 40 million inhabitants, vast resources, a strong industry, and a victorious army. The new empire claimed a place at the top of Europe. Its economy grew rapidly, railways connected cities and regions, science and technology experienced an upswing. Berlin became the capital of a power that presented itself self-confidently and proudly.
But this rise also triggered mistrust. France felt threatened, Russia and Austria observed the new strength, and Great Britain feared for the balance in the long term. France in the shadows. For France, the defeat of 1871 was a deep shock. The Third Republic not only had to stabilize itself domestically, but also cope with the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. The idea of revenge shaped politics and society, but militarily, France was initially too weak to challenge Germany. Instead, it sought allies. Step by step, France moved closer to Russia and later also to Great Britain. In the long term, this created the counterweight that was to confront Germany in the First World War. Austria's role after 1871. Austria had been ousted from Germany by the defeat of 1866 and had stood idly by in the War of 1870. For the Habsburgs, it was clear that they no longer had a leading role in Germany. Instead, the focus was on the Balkans and the confrontation with Russia. This also created a field of conflict here that was later to become dangerous for Europe. Russia and Germany. Russia had looked on neutrally during the War of 1870 and gained its own advantages in the process by repealing the provisions of the Peace of Paris of 1856 on the Black Sea. Initially, relations with Germany were good, but in the long term, conflicts of interest in the Balkans led to tensions. This was where the interests of Austria, Russia, and later Germany collided, a powder keg that was to explode in 1914. Great Britain, splendid isolation. After 1871, Great Britain remained in its traditional attitude. It did not interfere directly in continental wars, but observed in order to maintain balance. But here, too, mistrust stirred. The growing German fleet, industrial strength, and the claim to world standing made the empire increasingly a rival. This was not yet an acute problem, but it was announced. Alliance policy and balance. Bismarck understood that Germany was powerful after 1871, but could also have been isolated. Therefore, he pursued a clever alliance policy: close contacts with Russia, a compromise with Austria, distance to France, and efforts not to upset Britain. His goal was clear: France could never find a strong ally. This policy kept the balance stable for a few years, but after Bismarck's resignation in 1890, this changed. The long shadow of 1871. The shift in power in 1871 thus had three central consequences. Germany became the strongest continental power. France was desperately looking for revenge, and the European balance was thrown out of joint. This planted the seeds for the great conflicts of the 20th century. The First World War was not an immediate result of 1870, but without this war and its consequences, it would have been hard to imagine. A new self-image. For Germany, the victory over France was not only a political event, but also an intellectual turning point. It now saw itself as a nation among the great powers, with a special mission in Europe. This self-image led to growing self-confidence, and sometimes to arrogance. The attitude that you have to have a place in the sun developed from this new self-image. After 1871, Europe had become a different continent. The cards had been reshuffled, and relations between the powers were on an uncertain foundation. In the next chapter, we will therefore turn to the culture of remembrance, how monuments, literature, and political instrumentalization captured the war in the collective memory, and how it had a long-lasting effect.
Chapter 17. Culture of Remembrance, Monuments, Literature, and Political Instrumentalization. Wars don't end with the last shot. They live on, in memories, in monuments, in stories that are passed on to generations. The Franco-German War of 1870-71 was an impressive example of this. In both Germany and France, a lively culture of remembrance developed after the armistice. It shaped politics, society, and identity far beyond the immediate events. Germany, pride and national consciousness. For Germany, the war was the founding myth of the new empire. Without Sedan, without Versailles, without the triumph over France, the founding of the empire would not have been possible. Accordingly, the memory was cultivated. Countless war memorials were erected in towns and villages. Often they were obelisks, stone lions, or statues dedicated to the fallen for the fatherland. Sedan Day on September 2nd became an unofficial national holiday. Schools held celebrations, clubs organized parades, and the press recalled the glory days.
Literature and painting glorified the victories. History paintings showed Bismarck and Versailles or heroic cavalry attacks. Novels and poems praised sacrifice and national unity. The result was a picture of war that told less of suffering and destruction than of greatness, glory, and love of the fatherland. France, mourning and revenge. Quite different in France. Here, the memory was marked by pain. Pain over the defeat, over the lost provinces, over the humiliation in Versailles. Monuments were also erected in France, but they had a different tone. They commemorated the fallen, the suffering of the civilian population, the heroic resistance in Belfort or during the siege of Paris. The memory of Alsace-Lorraine was particularly strong. Cards with the lost provinces hung in schools, poems and songs evoked the hope of return. Entire generations grew up with the conviction that France would one day have to take revenge. War in literature. The war also found its echo in literature. In Germany, poets such as Theodor Fontane wrote about it. Fontane, who himself was a war correspondent, combined sober observation with patriotic undertones. In France, the pain was dealt with in literature. Particularly well known is Émile Zola's novel La Débâcle, which mercilessly depicts defeat and emphasizes the cruelty of war. Thus, two literary traditions faced each other, one glorifying, the other critical and accusing. Political instrumentalization. Memory is never neutral. In both countries, it was used politically. In Germany, the memory of the war served to legitimize the empire. The victory was presented as proof that unity had been achieved through strength and sacrifice. The government used this image to consolidate loyalty to the new state. In France, defeat became the engine of political life. Republicans recalled the failure of Napoleon III and presented the Republic as the answer. At the same time, nationalists used the memory to keep the idea of revenge alive. The war thus became a constant point of reference for political discourse on both sides of the Rhine. Memory in everyday life. It was not only large monuments or books that kept the memory alive. The war was also present in everyday life. Veterans associations cultivated camaraderie, held festivals, and remembered fallen comrades. School lessons gave children an image of the war that shaped their view of Germany or France. Family stories told of fathers and grandfathers who had fallen or were returning home. In this way, memory became part of the collective memory, deeply rooted in everyday life. European perspective. The war was also remembered outside of Germany and France. For many Europeans, it was a turning point. Germany's rise to become a great power, the weakening of France, the shift in the balance of power. Newspapers, chroniclers, and historians throughout Europe reflected on this turning point. The memory of 1870-71 was thus not only a national but also a European matter. A long shadow. The culture of remembrance had consequences. It contributed to the fact that the two countries did not let go of each other. Germany proud of its victory, France obsessed with revenge. This mutual fixation created a climate in which understanding was hardly possible. Thus, memory itself was a factor that paved the way to the First World War. With the culture of remembrance, we have almost reached the end of the history of this war. But one question remains: why does the Franco-German War continue to have an impact today? In the last chapter, we take stock and look at the traces that this war has left in Europe's collective memory.
Chapter 18. Conclusion. Why the war continues to have an effect today. The Franco-German War of 1870-71 was more than a century and a half ago, and yet it still has an effect in many ways today. It was more than a conflict between two states. It was a turning point that redrew the political map of Europe and profoundly changed the relationship between nations, armies, and societies. In retrospect, it is clear that this war was a founding war, for Germany in the literal sense, for France figuratively. And it was a starting point for developments that reached into the 20th century war. The German nation-state. For Germany, 1871 meant the fulfillment of a centuries-old dream. For the first time since the Holy Roman Empire, there was a unified German state again. The founding of the empire in Versailles was both a symbol and a reality, a symbol of the superiority of Prussian politics and military power, a reality of the union of princes under one emperor. But this founding act also brought tensions. Unity had been enforced from above, less through popular movements than through wars. The new empire was strong, but also militarized. The idea that unity is created through weapons shaped the self-image. France's wound. For France, 1871 was a national catastrophe. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine and the humiliation of Versailles created a trauma that shaped the Third Republic from the very beginning. The idea of revenge was more than just political rhetoric. It became part of the French identity. Entire generations grew up with the conviction that one day the lost provinces would have to be reconquered. This attitude made an understanding with Germany almost impossible. It laid the foundation for the tension that led to the First World War in 1914. Militarism as a legacy. In both Germany and France, the war left a tendency towards militarization. Armies were seen as guardians of the nation, officers as role models. War heroes were revered, Sedan Day and commemorations shaped the calendar. This glorification of soldiering and sacrifice made wars appear in many minds not as catastrophes, but as necessary tests of a nation. This created an intellectual climate that favored future conflicts. Europe in a new equilibrium. At the European level, the war radically changed the balance. Germany rose to become the strongest land power. France fell behind. Austria oriented itself to the southeast. Russia gained freedom. Great Britain watched suspiciously. The concert of powers which had existed since the Congress of Vienna was shaken. Instead of equilibrium, a new, unstable structure prevailed, and Germany was at the center. Memory and myth. The War of 1870-71 was mythically exaggerated in both countries. In Germany, as a glorious victory that brought unity. In France, it was a bloody disgrace that demanded retribution. These contrasting memories contributed to the fact that the two nations repeatedly saw each other as hereditary enemies. The war became a permanent point of reference, influencing political decisions and public moods. Lessons for the present. Today, in a united Europe, it is hard to imagine that two neighbors regarded each other as hereditary enemies for decades. And yet, the history of 1870 still shows how quickly wars can poison relations between peoples and how long such wounds remain. In a way, the European Union is also a response to this experience. It tries to transfer what once divided into common structures. Alsace-Lorraine, once a symbol of hatred, is now a link between France and Germany. Why the war continues to have an impact today. The Franco-German War continues to have an impact today because it initiated fundamental developments. He created the German Empire, which shaped the course of European history. He founded the French idea of revenge, which contributed to the First World War. He changed the balance of Europe by making Germany the dominant continental power. He left behind a culture of remembrance that shaped entire generations. These long-term effects show that wars do not end with the last shot. They live on in institutions, mentalities, and borders, often for decades. Final thoughts. The War of 1870-71 was a short but decisive conflict. It lasted only a few months, but its consequences determined Europe for half a century. It was triumph and trauma at the same time, and a lesson in how closely victory and defeat, splendor and sorrow are connected. By remembering him, we better understand why Europe has been marked by the antagonism between Germany and France for so long, and why today's friendship between the two countries is so precious.